So picture this. It's January 2026, and the world wakes up to some absolutely stunning news. A dramatic military raid right in the heart of Venezuela. How on earth did we get to that point? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break it all down. We'll trace the anatomy of that intervention, from a nation plunged into darkness to a world completely divided.
It all happened in the first few days of 2026. U.S. Special Operations Forces carry out this lightning-fast raid in Caracas, and they actually capture President Nicolas Maduro. I mean, it was an unbelievable turn of events, really the climax of a crisis that had been building for years.
But look, something this big doesn't just happen overnight, right? It's not like it came out of nowhere. It's really the final, dramatic act in a very long story. So the big question we have to ask is, how did it come to this? To get the answer, we've got to rewind the clock.
The seeds for that 2026 raid, they were actually planted years before, and not on some battlefield, but in the country's own crumbling infrastructure. It all started with the collapse of the most basic service you can think of, electricity.
Back in 2019, Venezuela was literally plunged into darkness. And not just once, it happened over and over again. We're not talking about your average power outage here. These were catastrophic, nationwide failures that knocked out power for days at a time and just paralyzed the entire country.
So what on earth was going on? Well, depending on who you asked, you got two totally different stories. The official government line was sabotage, a sophisticated cyber attack led by the United States. But, energy experts, and even people inside the state power company, they were telling a different story. They pointed to something a lot less spy novel, but just as destructive. Years and years of neglect, corruption, and a brain drain of the skilled engineers who actually knew how to keep the grid running.
And if you really want to grasp the scale of the problem, all you have to do is follow the money. A National Assembly investigation found that of $100 billion that was supposed to be invested in the electrical system, a staggering $80 billion was allegedly embezzled. Just gone. Projects were paid for, but they were never even built. The whole system was basically hollowed out from the inside.
So you have this deep internal decay, right? It's like a huge pile of dry tinder just waiting for a spark. And as 2025 drew to a close, that spark was about to be lit, pushing the whole situation to a global boiling point.
This time, the attack wasn't on the power grid. Nope, it was aimed right at the heart of the nation's economy, the state oil company, PDVSA. A major cyber attack, which sources said was likely ransomware, brought its admin systems and all of its oil exports to a complete standstill.
And the response from the government? Oh, it was immediate and it was furious. PDVSA had put out this statement framing the attack as foreign aggression, saying it was an attempt to steal Christmas. The rhetoric was getting hotter and hotter, and you could just feel that a final confrontation was getting closer.
And that brings us right back to where we started. January 3rd, 2026. The United States gives the green light to Operation Absolute Resolve, a direct military strike against the Venezuelan leadership in Caracas.
Now you've got to understand, the mission profile for this was incredibly specific. This was not a full-scale invasion. We're talking about a targeted operation by over 200 special forces with one primary objective: capture Nicolas Maduro. And the official reason they gave, they called it a law enforcement mission.
And it wasn't just the U.S. calling it that. Independent analysts pretty much agreed with that assessment. A report from CSIS just days later called the operation laser-focused and made it really clear that this was not some kind of shock and awe campaign designed to bring down the whole government.
And you can really see that focus right here in the target list. Look at what they hit. Military units that posed a direct threat to the operation, like air defense systems or units that could launch a quick counterattack. But what's just as important is what they didn't hit. Runways, port infrastructure, naval ships. All of that was left alone. The damage was meant to be precise and very limited.
So the big question is, how was this incredibly risky raid so successful? Well, this is where the whole story really comes full circle. Remember that systemic rot that caused the blackouts? It had also eaten away at the military. Air defense systems were just left out in the open, not even camouflaged. Command and control was so slow to react. Basically, years of neglect and corruption meant their armed forces just couldn't mount an effective defense. It allowed U.S. forces to achieve total surprise.
The raid itself was over in a matter of hours, but the political and legal storm that followed, that was just getting started, and it showed just how deeply divided the world was on the issue.
And you had these two completely opposite takes on what happened. The U.S. administration defended it, saying, look, this was a necessary law enforcement mission against the leader charged with narcoterrorism. But then you had the United Nations fact-finding mission come out and call it what it was, in their view, a military intervention that straight up breached international law
and violated Venezuela's sovereignty.
And let's be clear, even a surgical strike has a very real human cost. It's not a bloodless event. Estimates put the number of people killed at around 75. That number included dozens of Cuban special forces who were serving as Maduro's bodyguards. And tragically, at least 2 civilians were also confirmed to have been killed.
And this quote from the UN really captures the incredibly complex, messy reality of the whole situation. They condemned the U.S. attack as illegal, but in the very same breath, they made it clear that this didn't just wipe the slate clean for the Maduro government's own record, which the UN mission described as involving years of repression that amounted to crimes against humanity. It's a tough one to wrap your head around.
So, the raid is over. The immediate objective was achieved. But after the dust settled, you're left looking at a country whose future is more uncertain, more up in the air than ever before.
Which leaves all of us with the critical question at the heart of this entire story. Does this intervention, born from years of internal collapse, represent a real chance for Venezuela to finally rebuild? Or is it simply the beginning of a new and maybe even more volatile chapter of instability? The honest answer is, that's a story that is still being written.